The Banking Scene Director's Cut goes behind the scenes, sharing stories and insights to help you build the bank of tomorrow.
So, Rick, you had a bit of a revelation, an epiphany at our event last week in Luxembourg, where you realized that there is actually a very strong link between ethos, something that you wrote about in your book, and relevance in banking.
Well, I knew that there was a clear link, but what I realized building the story I was going to present is that there's probably more into that than just the idea of ethos and behavior, etc. Because if you put it in a different perspective, then you start to think differently about things as well. And suddenly you get many more reasons why that ethos in banking becomes so important.
And you made some very tangible statements in the blog that you wrote. Some that I really liked as sound bites. For example, deciding not to decide is a decision, which is actually, I think a lot of people hide behind not making decisions. How do you link that to the ethos and relevance?
Well, what's interesting, and that's a piece that I forgot to share on stage, was the sentence with essentially three pieces, saying that silence creates defaults, defaults create behavior, and behavior creates identity. And in my book, I define ethos as the identity of an organization. So in that respect, that silence stands for the decisions that you're deciding not to decide on. So the silences, identity, the behavior, and that's how I translate it in a very short way. Ethos. Ethos is not about what we believe, what is good or wrong, but really translation into our behavior. But if you translate that yet again into decisions, suddenly all these things become much more tangible for an organization and for people.
You had made a comment just before your presentation, actually, which you repeated on stage, which I was quite surprised about because I'd never viewed your book in this way, when you said that you had a comment from some people that they thought it was a sort of very leftish view of the world. The whole ethos is a bit tangible and fluffy. Maybe it's because I knew that your whole construct was around the very ancient principle of ethos, pathos, and logos, that I'd never seen it that way. Because I knew your philosophical triangle.
But as I write in the blog that's based on the conversation that I brought on stage, I think it has more to do with the subtitle of the book than the main title. The subtitle is Embracing Values and Ethics for a Meaningful Transformation. The moment they see ethics, they think, leftish. And I think that is wrong. So maybe if I would have known that by hindsight, might have chosen a different subtitle. Because some of the people who said that to me, the people who told me that they believed that the story was leftish, not everyone read it. So a few immediately added to that, I haven't read the book, but it looks kind of leftish. I think that's predominantly because they see ethics in there and they stop reading because they categorize it already into a corner, which is more about statements and about making a point rather than anything else. And if you put a book into that category, you're or for or against it. But if you're against it, you're very unlikely to read it.
That's a shame, that, because those people are missing out on a lot of your core central theme.
Well, maybe we can change our minds.
It's all about coherence. I mean, and that was something that you brought up in the blog, is that coherence is a source of trust. And it's not those who necessarily make the strongest statements. And as a matter of fact, the statements are not really what builds trust. What builds trust is behaving the same way all the time and behaving that way under pressure. And as you had pointed out, ethos is not a leadership trait. It is a governance responsibility. It's something that brings the whole company together. And that to me was a key thing. Again, linking it to relevance, because that's what makes a financial institution relevant to its customers.
Yeah, but also to its employees in a way. What I also explained is that if you have that coherence in your actions and in your decisions, and you make all the trade-offs very explicit, people are aware of it, you will also get into a situation where a lot less decisions will be reopened to evaluate whether that was the right decision or not, because things are clear. They're fundamentally clear based on the values, the reality that you as an organization stand for. And that by definition also makes your organization much more agile. It makes it much easier to take decisions and that way to, make new steps much faster than competition where those decisions have not been explicitly grounded into a governance model. So it's not just about making the marketing fluff reliable, but it's also internally making the organization faster and more agile because things are clear. You have that coherence not just in the messaging, but also in decision making.
And in the actions, because it's the actions, as you had pointed out, you had taken a very inside-out view in your book, whereas now upon reflection, you're reflecting as a outside-in view of ethos, not ethics, and how that impacts relevance, which is all contextual for the customers.
No, absolutely.
And you particularly, because it was Luxembourg, you had drilled down on private and wealth banking, and you had noted 4 pressures that make that ethos visible and tangible. And I'm going to challenge you on one of them, just to play devil's advocate. But it's not the
It
first
wasn't
one.
just to make that ethos tangible and visible, but it's more like the trends that are currently shaping private and wealth banking, whether or not you have a very clear ethos. Those are simply dynamics that we see in the market today. And then the question was, how does that shape bank of the future?
Does it make it relevant? I mean, the first one that you had discussed was intergenerational wealth transfer, which we have discussed before about what is the wealth for and what is expected to be done with it. And you had already told me how family offices bring potentially large groups of people together to make decisions around that. And you'd said advisors are no longer the mediators of return optimization alone. They become the interpreters of the trade-offs, right? But your second one is the one where I'm going to challenge you on. And it's not a challenging from a professional statement because you have seen it, but it's just, I'm going to challenge you from a philosophical point of view, where you had said legacy beyond financial return. Okay? And that people who have got a large amount of wealth, big private funds, that kind of a thing, where clients increasingly think of continuity, of impact, of legacy, how they're going to be remembered. And my challenge is that valid? The client might think that, but how will that shape the decisions being made if it almost becomes written in stone? You know, legacies sometimes aren't good. If I can think of the Crusaders probably thought they were doing the right thing when they conquered the world in the name of Christianity, but now history looks back and the Crusaders maybe are viewed in a different light than they were then. So legacies have a way of changing because society changes, value changes, the world changes. So how does that work in wealth management?
I think like the Crusaders thing is a bit off topic. When you talk about like a wealth manager dealing with a client, suppose that, for example, you are a super rich client, but you had some health issues in your family that you really want to deal with. And you want to make sure that the wealth that you earned, that a big chunk of that goes, of course, to heritage, to the children, etc., to the family wealth. But another big chunk must go to scientific research. That kind of philanthropy. And then, of course, it's very hard for that wealth advisor to evaluate him on the results that will be there in like 10 years. It's impossible to do. So I think their legacy has more to do with the individual's wish, why he would like to be remembered. And if you bring that back to the Crusaders, suppose there was a king that set up the whole Crusader guard to go to, back then that was seen as a good thing. I'm not going to evaluate whether that is a good thing or not, but that the idea of legacy has to do with, what do you want to leave behind when you die, and increasingly more that is less about the financial returns, and there's a growing demand to have a positive return beyond the financials as well with that money. That's what I
The impact. No, I knew exactly what you meant. I was just being, as I say, playing devil's
yeah.
advocate in the value of legacy. 'Cause as you said, okay, somebody could leave their wealth to support scientific research. However, if the fund manager 10 years after that person had deceased invests in something really controversial, then that legacy could get tarnished by, somebody turning around and saying, well, this whole controversial research into cloning humans was funded by, this super rich person who died 10 years ago. That's all where I was playing.
But those are like, you can invest in a company, and if that company is 100% ESG compliant, no defense, only green energy, and then suddenly because of a changing economic condition or just decision of a new CEO decides to go for nuclear because he believes that that has the most positive impact on nature because less square meters are being used for the amount of energy consumed, different parameters, different evaluation. It may not fit with your values, but those are things that are very hard to, if you would need to consider all those elements, there's probably no money to be invested, I guess.
No, I think all that I was trying to do was highlight the challenges of wealth managers staying relevant.
Yeah.
What you could do today to be relevant to your customers, that has to continuously change. Even for legacy investments and legacy wealth management is understanding the wishes and intent of the fund, not just interpreting the letter of what they had said. And also to make sure that when you are having legacy instructions, that they don't constrain your ability to do what society would perceive to be the right thing at that time.
Mhm.
And I do consciously say what society would perceive to be the right thing, because I think that changes. We've spoken about that very often as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You also brought up, was your fourth one, I've skipped out some of them, but technology as an enabler and a stress factor. Again, great sound bites there. Speed without ethos creates opacity, and speed with ethos creates confidence. Why didn't you put these things in your book, Rick? These are great sound bites.
In Dutch, we say verschillend inzicht. It's the things that you realize after the writing. Maybe a bit of help from a virtual friend. But yeah, it does make sense. I think the whole idea of ethos, that's so fun thinking about it. You can keep writing about it if you want. It's not a silo thing, and it evolves constantly.
And your closing argument in the blog, or your closing statement in the blog, is all about legibility. So making things transparent for your customers. You said Ethos explains how institutions develop internal coherence, and relevance is how that coherence is tested externally. So in other words, remaining relevant to your customers is the ultimate test of how your ethos has been interpreted by customers, right? So you had actually made the statement there, it doesn't make it banks good or bad. It just makes them legible to their clients, regulators, society. So with that closing statement, are we likely to see another follow-up book from Rick Kuckelbergs?
I was thinking about it when I wrote it. That's probably the reason why you asked me that question. I don't know. But while writing it, I thought, there could be some ideas in it, but I'm not ready for another book just yet.
And on that note, we'll wrap this week's edition of the Banking Scene Director's Cut. Thank you very much, Rick.